Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Nafasi.com and Eritrea YouTube channel. Today we have a special guest from Kenya, Mr. Karanja Gaçuça, who is a journalist, very active in the social media platforms. He holds Twitter Spaces and talks about a lot of African issues, the Horn of Africa issue, Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, and all these different subjects. He is very knowledgeable about the political developments in our region, and he's also active in U.S. politics. He's very well-rounded journalist who is keenly aware about the No More movement, and he has been organizing a lot of spaces as it regards to that. Karanja is a Kenyan journalist based in the U.S. He's a publisher on the briefscoop.com and executive director of pan-Africamedia.org. Karanja has played key organizing roles during the Occupy Wall Street, and also he uses the social media to break down stereotypical perceptions of African peoples, both on and off the continent. And he was also a part of a panel that discussed the Africa Peoples Forum.org, which was held at the Eritrean Community Civic Center in Washington, D.C. last Sunday, that talked about economic development, U.S. Africa, people's struggles to connect the power of story changing narratives to push for policy change. And his presentation was one of the most, outstanding that resonated. And so I asked him to come and to talk about, what he talked about in the panel and more. So without further ado, Mr. Karanja Gaçuça, please introduce yourself. First of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce you to the Eritrean community, to the African community. This is a great opportunity for us to talk about our issues with Africans. So without further ado, welcome, and please say something about yourself.
Hello, Emmanuel. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, my name is Karanja Gaçuça, and I am a journalist, a credentialed White House correspondent, and the publisher of thebriefscoop.com, which is an online platform that seeks to cover African affairs, issues of interest to the Pan-African family, the Trans-African family, and primarily seeks to challenge narratives about Africa, challenge the global status quo, the current status quo of the global financial arrangement, and to cover more accurately the questions and issues of Africans from an African perspective. I chose to start publishing thebriefscoop.com as a result of the observation of the dearth that exists currently, or rather the lack of, the dearth of media covering African affairs from an African perspective, and hence thebriefscoop.com was born. The current status quo that of Africa as a place where as a source of free labor, an extractive, a source of extraction for raw materials to drive industry in both the West as well as the East, is an untenable situation, an unsustainable situation that must not continue and that must be challenged. And so this is what I seek to do in my journalism.
One of the things that you mentioned is pan-Africanism. There's always something hovering above what pan-Africanism is. Can you say what your perception or what the meaning of pan-Africanism means to you as a Kenyan or as an African?
Yes, this is a really good question, and I'm glad you asked it, Emmanuel, because I'm seeing, for example, the USA African Summit, right, that is currently ongoing in here in Washington, where we are, where the term Pan-African is being bandied about by people who have absolutely no interest in Pan-Africanism, people who do absolutely everything to do the exact opposite of what the spirit of Pan-Africanism is. So in my view, the genuine, true Pan-African spirit is a spirit of um, coordinated, united. Let's see, how should I best put it? A movement of coordinated and united movements of Africans, wherever they are, including in Africa as well as the diaspora, for working for the benefit of the Pan-African family wherever they are found. That means in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, and by the way, in Asia and the Far East, because there are Africans in those places too, indigenous Africans, indigenous, people in those places too. And it is a philosophy that seeks to ensure, that must ensure the well-being, that Africans take control and ownership of our means of production everywhere we are on our continent, as well as in all of the places that we occupy, to ensure dignified living for people of African descent everywhere that we are. What it requires is a movement, is action in a united fashion of Africans all across the globe. It does not necessarily mean it doesn't mean some of the things that I've heard bandied about Pan-Africanism is that it's this idea of a utopia where all Black people must love each other and think of each other as brothers and sisters, which quite frankly, I believe we already do, but it's not sort of some type of a forced marriage where we all come together and must live with each other, because there's some people who just will choose not to. What we see, for example, in other um, countries or places where there has been integration, including in Africa, or even if you want to go outside of Africa to the EU, we see that for the most part, Germans continue to live in Germany, the French continue to live in France, the Belgians continue to live in Belgium. The only thing that the EU did was allow free movement of people and goods as and when needed. And so Pan-Africanism, a true Pan-Africanism, does not have to be much different than that. It does not mean that half of the population of Kenya is going to suddenly start living in Ethiopia or Somalia or Nigeria, for that matter. It just means that we collaborate in unison to make sure that the interests of African people, wherever we are guarded by our unity, by a united people working in tandem to ensure that we achieve a life of dignity on a global scale, starting by controlling our own means of production, which currently we do not.
I think it's a very, very interesting point that you brought up about the European Union. When you think about the European Union, you're looking at their history, there's not a whole lot of love. But when you think about Africa, even though there's a lot of breakdown because of the colonial legacies, when Africa started to come around in the 50s and the 60s, there is a desire for all Africans to come and the movement for some kind of unity for Africa, at least in rhetoric or in desire and want for people to aspire towards one great Africa, no matter what that unity looks like, and One of the people that spearheaded was Kenyatta, your president, President Kenyatta. And so I think in Africa, there is more of an emotional bond when it comes to the connection, as opposed to the Europeans who have been fighting all of this centuries and decades, and they don't really have any love for each other. And you can take the French with the Germans, French with the British, and they've always been at odds with the colonial legacies and what have you. So that brings me back. Uh, the current state of Africa that you see, do you think it is headed in the right direction in terms of its connectivity, especially in the Horn of Africa, uh, in relation to Kenya? Do you see that somehow combining or coming together?
Absolutely, and those are good points you make about Europe, for example. They have no love lost between each other and themselves, right? Like you go far when you go, for example, between the French and the Germans. You don't even need to leave France. The French and the Corsicans, right within France, they don't get along. They don't particularly care for each other. There's a Basque separatist movement right there in France, a Corsican separatist movement right there in France. The Irish and the British have been fighting each other for over 800 years, right? There's a Catalan separatist movement in Spain. So there's not much love lost, but for practical purposes, for practical reasons, they do come together. And that is what I'm suggesting is what Pan-African needs to be. It just needs to be a very practical understanding, a very practical arrangement where we move in unison to protect our interests. What we have seen is that when we are divided, what we get in return is a divide and rule system that manages to extract our resources, our labor for free, and dominates us economically and does not allow us to advance our economies, our societies, or our communities. What I'm seeing right now actually is very promising. The Africa, with over 70% of its population being young people under the age of 35, is at the forefront of, I believe there's an awakening in Africa right now of people recognizing that the current global status quo does not work for Africa. And even though people do not necessarily agree on how that deadlock will be broken, there is a desire to see something done about it. There is leadership that has taken off, that is doing things that are very promising, that look like they're moving in the right direction. And in particular, in the East African community of which we are a part, or of which Kenya is a part, I'm extremely proud of the East African community. It continues to grow. This year, the Democratic Republic of Congo joined. There is currently talks to add Somalia to the East African community. We saw the other day President Ruto of Kenya visit Eritrea and abolish visa requirements between Kenya and Eritrea. And he also visited, one of his first visits as when he was after inauguration as president was to Ethiopia, where he inaugurated the new Safaricom Ethiopia, as well as I forget what the other business, the other Kenyan business was. I forget if it was Equity Bank and Safaricom. It might just have been Safaricom. But anyway, there's a lot of businesses in Kenyan businesses in Ethiopia, and that's what President Ruto was there to inaugurate. But in addition, to make sure that he was demonstrating to the world that any suggestions of sort of isolation of Ethiopia. We're not going to fly with Kenya. We're not going to fly with President Ruto. And I'm especially encouraged and extremely proud that President Ruto made a state visit to Asmara immediately before coming to the United States for the so-called USA-Africa summit. Because where we need to be making alliances is with our neighbors. It is not with far off countries such as the United States. Our relationship with the United States, quite frankly, has never been beneficial to us Africans, and I cannot quite understand why we still continue to spend so much time looking outwards, looking westwards, or for that matter, even eastwards, rather than looking at each other as neighbors. But I think your question was, how are we doing? And I think we are doing really well. I think that the East African community is growing rapidly. And we are integrating. We are looking to start integrating our currencies starting in 2023. And I hope that this time that does take off. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement has started being implemented, and Kenya is actually at the forefront of that. We have started shipping batteries, and I forget what was the other item, but definitely batteries, car batteries to Ghana, as well as a couple of other countries. And so, yes, it's very promising. It's an exciting time to be African. I can't wait to see a time when our continent is trading with amongst ourselves to the tune of closer to 100%, something like 80%, rather than, I can't wait to see when we invert the current ratio, because currently we only trade with each other to the tune of about 15%, meaning we trade 85% with outsiders. We need to invert that and be trading with each other 85% and only importing 15%. Africa doesn't really need to be importing anything from outside of Africa if we realize our full potential. And that is a dream that I hope to witness within my lifetime.
I think that's really an excellent point, and we are all looking for that. And one thing that I would like you to address as a Kenyan, Kenya is a contradiction for a lot of Africans, especially the Horn of Africa. Looking at the history of Kenya, the history of colonialism, the British still being a very, very important part of what Kenya is today. So are the Indians, but there is a transformation taking place in Kenya. And for me, I think Kenya is one of the most important nations in Africa. It is playing very prominent role because it is serving a lot of landlocked countries, about 6 or 7 countries. That includes the Congo, Central Africa, South Sudan, Ethiopia, or Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, all these different countries. Without Kenya, Kenya, of course, they're not going to be able to do anything. And on top of that, you have China and the United States really vying for influence. China has invested a great deal. So the potential for Kenya is immense. And some of the work that's being done in the country is quite amazing, even though a lot of debt is being taken out to do that. Can you talk a little bit about the transformation that Kenya is ongoing, and how that is being manifested into the lives of the people of Kenya, and how that's going to impact the region? If you can touch a little bit about that, I would like that.
Well, so there's a lot of transformation, as you say, that is ongoing in Kenya currently. I'm somewhat dismayed, to be honest, because there's, of course, as you're aware, and as you just stated, so much of it is happening as a result of loans and as a result of, and is being done by outsiders, by the Chinese and what have you. But there is also a lot of homegrown talent and a lot of homegrown innovation that is taking place. Kenya is really at the forefront of tech innovation in Africa and the world, to be quite honest. M-Pesa, I will fearlessly say M-Pesa is the most advanced mobile money payment system on the planet, bar none. So Kenya is number one in mobile payments, without exception. It supersedes anywhere else on the planet, including anywhere else you might think of, China, Japan, or anywhere in the West.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it really is quite amazing. Um, there's also recently we inaugurated our the biggest steel manufacturing plant in Kenya, that is going to be manufacturing steel for use in Kenyan construction, and so that is very exciting. It is. I believe it is owned by a Kenyan. It is an Indian man, and I do believe he is Kenyan. I do hope he is Kenyan, because, as you stated, there is a lot of Indian influence, and it's never very clear which parts, of those Indians, whether they are Kenyan Indians or foreign, outsiders like Indian citizens, and it's tricky and murky. I never want to, I always want to believe that we can coexist peacefully with people who are loyal to the country, but and so I fully embrace the idea of Kenyan Indians, but there is also a big component of Indians that are not Kenyan, and whose loyalty does not seem to be Kenyan at all, and who bank their money and extract, essentially, perform extractive economics, expropriating profits to either the United Kingdom or India. And actually, primarily, I would say the United Kingdom and the West, the United Kingdom and Canada and such places. But anyway, it is a Kenyan manufacturing plant for steel, and that's very exciting. There are two cars that are being now. What's the word? I can't for the life of me.
Assembled.
Assembled, yes, assembled in Kenya. One of them is being assembled in Kenya. One of them I didn't quite fully understand, but it seems like it actually is more than just assembly. It's a Kenyan model called Mobus, which is a really good looking car. Looks like a Jeep. So there's exciting stuff happening in Kenya. Kenya's GDP is roaring. The economy is growing really, really fast. My beef with that is that economy, because it is driven by a lot of Chinese investment. It's not really. It's not a genuine Kenyan GDP, in my view. And this is another whole topic, because it would go into sort of discussions around how GDP is calculated. And I just don't, a lot of economics, I don't agree with it, because it really is just very devoid of the human factor. And it doesn't take into account, there's just a lot of things that economics doesn't take into account. It behaves as if economics and the economy are issues of pure math, and that is not the case. Economics is a human issue. I think of economics as a human science, as a social science, right? And so the economy, the GDP of Kenya looks like, and growth looks like it's amazing, but the profits are being expropriated to both China as well as the West. And so that growth does not translate to the Kenyan right at the bottom of the economic pyramid. And so that is my problem with that. And I think that we need more protectionist policies that ensure that growth is affecting people right at the bottom of the economic pyramid. We need to be demanding that people are paid living wages, prices of goods in Kenya, including consumer goods, right to the end consumer at the retail level in grocery stores, and that at that level are really comparable to prices in the United States. And when you consider that wages do not come anywhere near close to the United States, the cost of living is way too high, the minimum wage is way too low, and that is not a sustainable way to grow. And that needs to change in order to ensure that growth, that economic growth, is being enjoyed by the average Kenyan.
I would love to talk a lot about the Kenya, because a lot of Africans don't know about African issues, and the conversation between Africans about African countries. You talking about Kenya to me and to other Africans and to the American people and to the world, because of social media, is really a great opportunity for all of us to understand, especially from someone like you that have a depth of understanding. And I would like to ask you one more question. Do you think the leadership in Kenya, do you think the governance structures in Kenya can support the transition that you want to see happen? The people taking advantage of the growth opportunities that are taking place in Kenya, rather than the disparities, because if the disparities continue, eventually there's going to be instability in Kenya, and the history of Kenya uh, has shown that those kinds of things could happen when things are not equal. And so, do you think there's going to be an opportunity to transform the Kenyan governance structure, the just the Senate and all that? What do you think about that?
That's an interesting question. I don't necessarily think that is something that is happening soon, where the Kenyans might change the way we are governed, our system of government, because we inaugurated a new constitution. We promulgated a new constitution in 2010 that came into place in 2012. And so the election of Uhuru Kenyatta was under a new constitution that brought in a new system of government, where we now have a very American style constitution and American style system of government, complete with a very electoral college like
Wow.
sort of nuance, where we have senators, we have a Supreme Court, we have governors, and governors oversee counties, and then we have county assemblies, which are very similar to state legislatures in the United States. And I personally do not like this new system, because it really harkens to ethnic the ethnic federalism in Ethiopia, and we see what that led to in Ethiopia. But Kenyans like that system. They feel that it is representative, and it is a system that they want to see. I think Kenyans like the new constitution and want to. The argument is usually that the new constitution has not been fully implemented or been allowed to flourish and serve the Kenyan people. In fact, my view is that the system of trying to adopt these Western style systems of a single head of state and an opposition, um, I just don't know that it serves Kenya or Kenyans, or for that matter, Africa. and Africans. I really think that what we need is to relook at the systems that we are referring to as democracy. We need to reconsider when we are copy pasting systems, that are called democratic, such as the United States or the United Kingdom, that are really not democratic at all. Because what we see in the United States, two senators for California, two senators for Montana, that's not representation, right? 500,000 people in Montana and 37 million people in California, and both of them get two senators. California alone has a bigger population than probably about 10 western and midwestern states. If you were to, for example, take Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wisconsin. Sorry, let's not even include Wisconsin because it has a somewhat bigger population. Wyoming, I think I said the Dakotas. Those countries, those states in that area still have less than. I named over 5. That's 12 senators. I think I named 6. That's 12 senators between those states that I just named. 10 or 12, and California is still bigger than, the population of California is still bigger than all of those states combined, and yet, California still has 2 senators. Those states have about 10 or 12. That's not representation. The Electoral College, of course, is not representative. That's why Trump lost by 3 million votes and still became president. Can you imagine if that happened anywhere in Africa? There would be calls from all over the West to fix that, right? And then, of course, the Congress should be representative, but it's not because of deliberate gerrymandering, which is written into the Constitution. States are allowed to gerrymander to draw congressional districts in ways that ensure that the population, the group of people that you want in one congressional district, find themselves in one congressional district. And that means that you can draw the district in an L shape, an X shape, a circle. It doesn't matter. Like, there's no geographically, as long as the population is around. So Congress might have been representative, but gerrymandering renders it unrepresentative. And then, of course, we have a very openly partisan Supreme Court, and so that does not even pretend to deliver equal justice, right? Everybody knows which justices are going to rule in which direction. So there's nothing about any
So,
part of the American system
so
that is
as
democratic.
as the U.S. System unravels, as you just mentioned with the Supreme Court, Africans are picking it up, and just and running with it, or trying to run with it. Um, to stay a little bit on the Kenya and the Horn of Africa related issue, because it's extremely important to a lot of.
Well, before you move on, I did want to say, so these are not the systems we need to be copying. What we need to be doing is having systems that resonate and that are more representative. So we need to be careful about copying systems like those that do not work, right? So what we really need, in my view, is to look at the systems that worked for us. What worked for us? We used to be led, I think most African societies, by, there were societies that had monarchies, but even in those monarchies, there were still councils of elders that represented different groups, whether it was villages, communities, or, districts, whatever they were.
Indigenous.
Yeah, and this, I think, is a system that would really, could be replicated and modernized, such that, for example, we could have an executive, rather than having an executive that is led by a president. It could be led by an executive council, so a group of people that are similar to the Council of Elders, and they could be nominated by their different communities so that they could be representative. Now, when we have this new system of counties and governors, and county legislators. What happens is that because the counties have been drawn up along ethnic lines, what ends up happening is that, for example, a person from Mombasa could not ever expect to go run for office in Western Kenya and be elected, or from Central Kenya and go to Western Kenya, or vice versa. And that is not progress. We have moved. We have actually turned backwards. The old system that we had, we used to have provincial commissioners, district commissioners, and these were all people that were appointed by the national government, as we used to call it, as we still call it. They used to be appointed by the president, and actually that was a much better system, because then you would have district commissioners, provincial commissioners, chiefs. All of those people were people that were appointed by the president, and they were appointed from all over the country and sent to all different parts of the country. It was never by tribe or community. And so, in a way, I think we have actually stepped backwards. We look at it and think of it as progress, but I can see the pitfalls, especially when we see what has happened as a result of ethnic federalism in Ethiopia. So it's a cautionary tale. I would wish that we would move to an executive council, and we would go back to appointed leaders, appointed commissioners that would govern counties, rather than having these legislators that are all going to come from those communities, because then they become very insular. It's very easy to now divide the country along county lines, and we saw that into 2017, where a whole entire region refused to participate in the elections.
Um, you know, I would like to talk about Kenya a lot more. The area that I would like to touch upon is that the you mentioned earlier, President William Ruto went to Eritrea, visited Eritrea, and I think it is an extremely significant move for him, as you stated. Can you touch upon the strategic importance as it relates to Kenya, Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia? What that connection means, how uh, that interplays?
Well, of course, it's extremely, extremely significant. It's extremely significant on a couple of levels. A, because, of course, the West has vilified and treated Isaias Afwerki with disdain. And so President Ruto paying a state visit to Asmara, to Isaias Afwerki, and being seen walking around with Isaias Afwerki, is sort of saying it's no longer business as usual. We are going to do the things that are suitable for us, for our region, for our countries, and indeed having stronger ties with our neighbors, including Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, as well as, of course, continued relationships, which we already have with Uganda, Tanzania, as well as all of the other countries of the EAC, is important. And I think that what this portends is the possibility of a return to normalcy, or a return to the new status quo that had started developing when Abiy Ahmed had started forming alliances with, forming closer ties with Eritrea and Somalia. And that should continue. And I think that President Ruto being courted heavily by the West, as well as making those moves to indicate that he's at the same time, even while they court him, going to continue to do the things that he believes are best for Kenya and the region, is very positive. And I think that it gives a lot more room for Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki and MS, what's his name? Mohammed. I cannot remember his name right now. I'm not going to try to, the president of the current
Somalia,
president, yes, of Somalia.
Hassan.
Yes. It gives license to Hassan Sheikh Mohammed. It gives license to, I think it creates more room for the Horn to continue to go back to that arrangement that the Horn had started working on, of closer ties. And I think that that can only be a good thing because, of course, we know how important the Horn is to Africa, to the whole East African region. And we also know that it is contested. That region, there is a contest, an almost silent, because it's not openly stated, right, that the West is competing for control of the waters of Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti. But their actions definitely show that they are heavily contesting. Djibouti alone has bases from China, from the United States, and militaries from right across the Western world and apparently the East, right there in Djibouti. So there's clear competition for control of that region, even though they do not state it. They do not openly come out and state the importance of it. They pretend and suggest that the West does, that the interest in that region is purely for peacekeeping, right? Meanwhile, we see Al-Shabaab and other troublemakers being funded from outside and being very well funded, very well provided for. So it beggars the question, who is supplying these troublemakers with advanced weaponry, food, and continued operational costs? So it clearly, this region is extremely important to the world, and it being controlled by the region, by Africans, by the African countries that occupy the region, is a good thing. And that, I believe, is what Ruto's visit to Eritrea and strengthening of ties with the Horn portends and creates. It's a very exciting time for me.
That is really going to take me to my next question, which is, President William Ruto is here in the United States for the U.S. Africa Summit. And as you said, he's one of the courted leaders in Africa, because Kenya now is one of the most important countries in Africa, as I mentioned earlier. One of the things that I noticed today in the U.S. Africa Summit is Secretary Blinken and the was the Secretary of Defense. What's his name? They were together with three African countries, with Niger's President Mahmoud Bazoum, and was Somalia's president and Djibouti's president, basically thanking them for playing a key role in the security connection of the United States with Africa. And this was a highly publicized situation. It just shows you, and the U.S. Africa Summit has certain elements to it. Initially they said that they're not going to talk about the security, the competition with China and Russia, but they were openly talking about how China and Russia are going to be destabilizing factors in Africa, and they were basically, telling Africans. They initially promised that they're not going to lecture Africans about who they're going to partner with, whether it's China or Russia, but that is openly what's happening. And connect that with Kenya, and if you can, talk about it a little more.
So, of course, the USA Africa Summit was never about Africa, right? It was about the United States. It was about China. It was about countering the influence of China and Russia in Africa. By the way, And the way they are doing that is not by actually countering the power of Russia and China in Africa, because they really can't, right? China and Russia are way too powerful, so they cannot curtail their power. So what they are really doing is threatening Africans that if they interact with, that if they get too close to China, there will be consequences. So it really is a summit about carrots and sticks. And I think it's more sticks than carrots. It's about saying to Africans, look, we're going to give you $55 billion over the next 3 years in quote unquote so called aid. It's actually loans that are Shylockian in nature, very high interest rates. And it's 55 billion for 55 countries, so a billion each. When you contrast that with 68 billion spent on Ukraine alone this year, and counting, it's a drop in the bucket. Whereas in reality, the payments from that 55 billion will probably amount to 10 times more, 500 billion in repayments over the next 10 years or so. And all in the meanwhile, letting African leaders, letting Africans know that if you play around, if you get too close to China, if you get too close to the sky, you will melt and burn and fall to the ground. And the United States will assist in that. So it really is it's a summit that is more so, in my view, uh, a summit about threats, right? Threats of violence, economic violence against Africans and African countries if they do not play along with the United States. Now, the thing about that to me is very encouraging is that what Ruto has shown is that he will not be pushed around. Now, going back to the conversation we were having earlier about pan-Africanism, is that, of course, Ruto as an individual, as one African president, is not powerful enough to counter the threats of destabilization that might come from the West if he were to move closer to China or to Russia. And so, what is needed is for Africans to come together in unison and stand our ground and make it very clear that we will make the alliances that suit us, whether they are with China, with Russia, with with Belarus or whoever else suits our interests, in order to advance our economies and our interests globally. Africa has to have our own foreign policy that does not involve simply implementing United States foreign policy. It's time that we build our own strong enough armies and trans-African army that can defend Africa. It's time that we built our own weapons. It's time that we developed our own nuclear power in order to be able to stand alone by ourselves and demand a dignified place on the on the globe, and then we can trade with everybody else on equal terms as equal partners while defending our territories and our rights and our economies and our people and our societies and our ways of life. Um, it does not need the current status quo is not sustainable. It should not continue, as I stated earlier on. And the simple reality is that as much as the West is afraid that if they let go of slavery in Africa and treating Africa as a source of purely a source of free labor and free raw materials, their belief that they will collapse is actually unfounded. What we saw, you were at the African People's Forum on Saturday, where a number of people spoke about the Marshall Plan. By the way, the Marshall Plan, I heard some assertions made about the Marshall Plan that were not accurate. And in fact, the Marshall Plan, even though it was given to Europeans as loans, for the most part, was never repaid. It became agreed that the way to make Germany a market for American and Western European goods was to allow the German economy to flourish. And that was done. That was accomplished by forgiving all of the loans under the Marshall Plan. France had over $2 billion forgiven. And what ended up happening is that the great bulk of Marshall Plan loans um, were not repaid, and the receiving countries were only required to pay about 5% of the total to cover the administration costs. And the result has been, of course, that a well developed Western Europe has become both a market as well as a trading partner, equal trading partner with the United States. And I truly believe that. This belief by the West that strangling Africa and maintaining Africa as a poor, as a country where people are impoverished despite being extremely wealthy in terms of our manpower, our brain power, and our natural resources. That belief is unfounded, and that in fact, if the United States, the West, the East would stop continuing to strangulate Africa, that in fact what would happen is that we would have a much more prosperous globe, with Africa being an even more prosperous destination market for Western goods, and as well as a supplier of much higher quality products and complete, finished products, manufactured products. It would simply create a more equal world. It would not create an impoverished Western world as Western economists fear, which I believe is the reason why they continue to put a stranglehold on us.
I think we will talk about the U.S. Africa and the Africa People's Forum, but I would like to address a couple of issues that you raised. Uh, Number one, do African leaders, African countries, understand that what the United States is doing at the U.S. Africa Summit? Um, do they understand it clearly? And can you also conclude that they have, as you mentioned about William Ruto taking an independent path, uh, are there are there indications that they have rejected it? In other words, is this dead on arrival? Uh, is there a way for them to counter it? Obviously, China's presence and Russia's presence being very prominent, whether the threats or not. Africa has been partnering with them. It's going to go on. So, how do you see that playing out?
To your question, I do not believe that African leaders as a whole, as a collective, are aware that of what the USA Africa Summit is. I do believe that at least half, probably quite well over half, do really genuinely believe that the United States is interested in assisting Africa and Africans to develop, and probably maybe even distressingly, probably well more than half. And the great majority of them, I do not believe, are aware that there is little good to come of this. If they were, they would not have come. I understand that Isaiah Afwerki was invited, for example, and chose not to come. I was actually under the impression that he had not been invited. I gathered that he had been invited and chose not to come. Um, And if African leaders understood that this is really a summit about threats to our economies and our security, if we do not do the bidding of the United States, they wouldn't have come. So I fear that I don't believe that they understand it. The thing about President Ruto that I cannot explain, that I have come to accept, is that I cannot explain or understand his moves. He seems to move in very mysterious ways. He seems to be ahead of his opponents all the time. And so it would not surprise me if President Ruto uh, isn't doing what he believes is in the best interest of Kenya, the region, and the continent, while not doing anything to appear to rock the boat. But even that said, I can't help wondering if he really, was a bit more assertive, and, for example, sent the foreign minister or the deputy president, if that would still not accomplish whatever it is. If he's indeed playing a game of chess with the United States, it wouldn't surprise me. And the thing is, presidents don't rule by themselves, especially in a country like Kenya that is, we really are a democratic country. When the president comes here with a delegation that includes cabinet secretaries and members of parliament, um, legislators, um, you know, the people who sort of would like to ensure nefarious sort of activities are taking place don't necessarily only have to communicate with Ruto. They could also reach legislators, and ensure that the legislature, does their bidding. And so, even if they really are playing chess, which there's no way to know, right? If they're playing chess, there's just no way to know. Um, but even if they were, I think it's a dangerous game. I would have preferred to see African leaders saying to the president of the United States that if he wants to participate in an African summit, he is welcome to visit them in Addis Ababa when they convene for the AU summit. That would be a greater showing, in my view, of strength and negotiating prowess. When that happens, I will be far more encouraged. But for now, I will keep an open mind because I really am an Afro optimist. I am not one of these people that believes that nothing good can come of Africa and that is constantly decrying the intelligence of our leaders. I do believe that we do have intelligent leaders, and I believe that there's a number of them that are also cognizant of the doctrine that was spoken about in the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. So, there's a number of them that understand that there are carrots and sticks being wielded.